Hi everyone, how are you today? I'm going to be talking about the novel Storm by George R Stewart and continuing on this scratch art that I started in a previous video. So if you want to just tune out, go work on projects of your own while you listen, feel free to do so. I might show a few pictures on the screen, but nothing that you need to really pay attention visually for. So I just finished reading Storm. This was the third installment in the Reading the World challenge that a friend and I have been doing for about 5 years now. And we've already read a novel from America. We reread 2 novels from America previously. We read Lincoln and the Bardo by George Saunders, and we read East of Eden by John Steinbeck. And neither of those books was really our cup of tea for different reasons. So we thought, let's try another American novel and see if it fares any better. So this was Storm, and one of the reasons we chose it is because it is in the New York Review Book series, which we really like. The New York Review Book series often features lesser-known works or works that have fallen out of popularity in the case of Storm. And just generally speaking, seems to be a place you can find hidden gems in literature. So I can't remember how long I've been reading this book. It's been 2 months at least. I think 2 or 3 months, and it's a pretty lengthy book. Let me check to see how long it is. So Google is telling me it's roughly 350 pages, more or less. It feels a bit longer than that though, and I'll get into that in a bit. But what is Storm about? Well, Storm is one of the earliest, if not the earliest, ecological novels. It was published in 1941. George Stewart had developed a fascination with storms, and I believe he was previously a journalist. I'll just fact check myself here. George Rippey Stewart, he was a historian, novelist, and English professor. Sorry, so not a journalist, but already working in literary adjacent fields. And yeah, so he developed an interest in storms. He became what's known as a storm chaser. And, thinking about this being in the 1940s, 30s, 40s, storm chasing back then must have been a pretty low-tech affair. But he decided to write this novel effectively taking the angle that the storm is the main character. And the particular storm in question is a storm named Maria. And interestingly enough, this novel is where we get the modern day trend of naming storms, specifically hurricanes in the United States. I'm not saying that George Stewart invented it, but he popularized the method. And that's why we do that today. So this novel was fairly influential, not just in terms of naming storms, but even back in its day, it inspired some music, and it was also dramatized in a Walt Disney TV movie. So this wasn't an obscure book in its own day, and it had a fair bit of influence as we've just described. And it was pretty groundbreaking, because not really following a particular protagonist, but a storm, and then you have a series, a loose cast of characters, I would say, that do show up throughout the novel. So you've got the JM, or the junior meteorologist. You have the various leads of different agencies and just different officials, we'll call them, officials and professionals who work in and around weather, transportation, and all that kind of thing. So, and none of those, I shouldn't say none of them, many of those characters aren't named. They're known by their job title, which is significant. And one thing I did pick up on quickly in this book, which I personally liked, but I know it did rub some other Goodreads reviewers the wrong way, was that this book really, to me, personifies an entire era in American history. Think FDR, think the Conservation Corps, think, all of these efforts, initiatives, and really just national consciousness of taking care of land, and doing things like big infrastructure projects were huge at this time. And it made me a little nostalgic for that. It made me nostalgic for a time where we as a country took pride in having good infrastructure, in having national parks and taking care of things in that way. Now, I'm by no means immune to the realization that there was some problems with that. For example, a number of people were, coerced to give up land for the national parks. So it's there's pros and cons to having these public lands that were preserved, but I think the net effect was positive for that particular policy. And in general, this was an era where there were more men going into, I guess you could say, white-collar jobs and scientific/professional fields. And, there's this growing interest in all these fields, and not just growing interest, but technology is advancing. And you see that in the book as well, because there's the characters who use the old methods. There's actually kind of 3 levels of characters in this book. There's the old, I think his name is the Old Master. He's this old man who kind of just goes by vibes. So his weather forecasts are completely intuition slash vibes based. Then there's the chief meteorologist who, has a bit more method involved, but he doesn't use all of the new methods that the junior meteorologist uses. So kind of this look at different generations involved in weather forecasting, and a sense of changing times and improving technology, and man versus machines. There's a really great quote from later in the book. Let me see if I can find it here. So, yeah, this is towards the end of the book, but I really loved this. The machines being so fine, strangely, didn't make him feel better. It only made him feel that the man, by contrast, was the weak part that was going to pieces. Already he knew that he didn't trust his instruments, and when a pilot doesn't trust his instruments, he's going bad. But just the same, he began trying to look for the ground to know where he was, but there wasn't any ground, naturally. He was tired, he was going bad, he knew it. So this is about a pilot, and, there's this moment where he's really worried about the future of his flight and his passengers, and he realizes his plane is still okay, but he's getting tired, and that man-machine contrast, which you'll usually find in a lot of science fiction, is here put on full display in the context of just, how do people react in the face of a mighty storm. And as George Stewart points out at some point, it's not like a particularly remarkable storm either. He set out to describe an average storm, It's not like a Hurricane Katrina. It's not like any of these, you know, storm of the century situations. This is a regular storm. And in fact, when he decided to write the novel, I believe he was in Mexico. He was somewhere outside of the United States reading a newspaper and reading about storms back home in California. And it made him look at the storms in a different way to view it from another country, because, you know, he really didn't think much of the storms when he was living back home, but seeing them in another newspaper gave him a fresh perspective and made him realize, well, wait, this is actually big news. And after he got more and more interested in it, he eventually wrote this novel. So anyway, so that's kind of the gist of Storm. And when I say the gist, I really do mean the gist. I mean, the book kind of has these different segments to it. There are the highly technical segments where Stewart is describing people at their jobs, the course of the storm, the different weather patterns. I mean, these parts of the book are almost like an actual weather forecast. And then you've got some lovely poetic sections as well. Just places where he's describing the landscape and weather, and or the interplay between that and man's attempt to harness, you know, their resources to get people from A to B, or to, you know, make sure that the crops aren't going to fail. So I really did enjoy the poetic parts. Here's one where he's describing people walking in the rain. Men's hats dripping water, lost symmetry and spruceness. Below overcoats, trouser legs collapsed damply. Shoes lost all traces of shine, or disappeared beneath clumsy rubbers. Pink, green, and blue, women's raincoats put up a brave front, but the color was infirm and chalky with no touch of gaiety. And below the raincoats, shoes and clammy silk stockings were spattered and muddy. The very faces of men and women were hidden beneath umbrellas. As people passed at the corners, the umbrellas clicked and tangled. So yeah, there's lots of these different poetic interludes. And one thing I also really enjoyed is that he has quite a range of different characters. Some of them are civilians, we'll call them, and some of them are, you know, those government officials and or meteorologists, I'll learn how to say this someday, who are in charge of just keeping things running, rescuing foolish drivers from the snow, and so on. I think, you know, there's some interesting points that could be made here about women's roles and how, you know, this is a very masculine book in many ways. You'll notice that a lot of these specialists, these technical roles are filled by men, and as such there's an emphasis placed upon their job titles, less upon their names. And while the female characters are more, you know, just names. I'm not going to go into that in detail. It was just something that really jumped out at me, which seems to, I think, also personify the era in a very literary way, I guess. But one thing I really did enjoy, which I must not fail to mention, is he has a couple of animal characters as well that he follows here and there, like a coyote, or towards the end of the book, and a wild boar, a wild pig. And I really thought this is a book of perspectives. I mentioned a minute ago how sometimes characters are named and sometimes they're not named at all. And likewise with the animals, at some points of the story, the animals are their own characters, and then later it's just literally a dead pig that they found somewhere. And I did like how structurally the book, it really takes advantage of the use of perspective to show you different people and animals and situations from different angles. it's not, you know, a revolutionary use of this technique, but it works very well in a novel where the primary focus is the storm and its effects on a wide range of people and animals. So that's kind of a lot about Storm and things I liked about it, but I will be real with you, I did feel the book was far too long. I really did struggle in parts. Now I want to start by saying I do love slow burns, books that are slow burns, books where not much happens. I enjoy even some more rambly, semi-technical works like Moby Dick and Seven Pillars of Wisdom and South by Ernest Shackleton. All these books could be described as slow burns with heavy technical details and, you know, just a very, very methodical, slow pace. And, you know, so I really thought Storm would be right up my alley, honestly. I really didn't expect to find myself very, very bored through much of the book. It got a little bit better in the second half of the book, but I don't know that I would have finished the novel had it not been that we were doing this as a read-along, and I've already bailed on several novels for this read-along and just did not want to bail on another book. I really struggled to enjoy the book for that reason. And I do think it's a novel that would have done much better as a shorter book, a novella, even a short story, honestly. Because really, Stewart gets very bogged down in details, in my humble opinion. There's whole sections where he's describing certain things that are happening, certain pieces of work that these workmen are doing, and I just really had trouble visualizing a lot of it. Keep in mind, the book includes a lot of geography and a lot of technical descriptions, and there are no charts, there are no, you know, diagrams. And I guess I am a very visual person as well, but it just, in spite of having a technical degree myself, I did really struggle to follow this novel in some places. Especially when he's trying in great detail to describe some of this equipment, and I don't know, I really had trouble following a lot of it. So, anyways, that's kind of, that's really, I think, my lasting impression from Storm, which I'm sorry to say, because it's quite, I would say, in many ways, an original work, especially for the time it was written in. It was an early ecological novel, and even the style and manner and literary techniques it uses, in the way it uses them, are pretty groundbreaking for American literature, and I would say, you know, truly ahead of its time in these ways. But I just wasn't enjoying a lot of it, if I'm being quite honest. And again, I was really surprised because I have enjoyed other long, slow books that include lots of descriptions of weather and technicalities, but somehow it just was very difficult to follow much of Storm, and I did not find myself enjoying a lot of it. So ultimately, I don't know if I would recommend Storm. I think if the topic interests you, then it's worth trying it. But I found much to think about with Storm, but little to enjoy. Maybe that's a good way of putting it. So that's my thoughts on Storm. If you have read it or have other similar books you'd like to recommend, let me know. I think that that's probably the last American book that we'll read for Reading the World, at least for a while yet. I will say I liked it better than the previous two books that we read for America, which I don't know what that says about this book or those two books exactly, but I thought it was better, but it still was just too long, honestly. I think I really got the gist of it after, you know, the first third of the book. So, Storm by George R Stewart. Thanks for listening, and I will see you next time. Bye.